It was an aircraft that could take any amount of damage, any amount of flak, and it would get you home.
I had the distinction of being shot down not far from Boulogne.
I was really scared, scared stiff on many, many occasions.
It happened more than once that a tail came off the machine, and at that time nobody whose tail came off survived.
At times I was shit scared.
He said, well, you'll only be about an hour and a half. Won't take very long. In fact, it took just about 12 months, because that's when I got shot down.
The Hawker Typhoon stirred up very mixed feelings with anyone who had anything to do with it after it came into service with the RAF on the 11th of September 1941 at Duxford Aerodrome in Cambridgeshire.
My first meeting with the Typhoon was at Duxford in 1942. We were in the first Typhoon wing, and eventually we went on operations, but they were peripheral operations. They're going mainly along the French coast with the object of a customer asked to flying in the Typhoon on operations and avoiding, they hoped, and successfully, avoiding an aircraft being shot down and being taken to pieces by the Germans. My impression of the machine was that it was a very clumsy instrument. It was big and about twice the size of a Spitfire, I should think, and it had very clumsy attributes, such as a car-type door and a window which could be wound down rather like a car door. So it wasn't a favourable first impression, but eventually we got to find it quite a comfortable machine, although it was a very apt to judder. It happened more than once that a tail came off the machine, and at that time nobody whose tail came off survived. The engine was a Sabre, 24-cylinder. It wasn't reliable, and the consequence was that a number of people had to make forced landings.
The pilot calmly discusses his ordeal with other members of his squadron.
The Typhoon was a far more powerful machine than the Spitfire, as you'd expect. There were only, I think the Spitfire had a Merlin engine at 12 cylinders, and the Typhoon had a Sabre engine, Napier Sabre engine with 24 cylinders. So as you would expect, it was much more powerful and much faster, much higher rate of climb. And in fact, it was at that time, I think, probably the fastest fighter in the world.
Much of the Hawker Typhoon lies back in those days of the biplanes, those old sylvan-winged beasties flying around the sky. However, underneath the skin of those biplanes was a unique assembly invented by Sir Sidney Cam, as he later became, which used bolts to bolt tubes together, which made for an easy way of constructing an airframe. Anybody could do it. Following on from the biplanes, such as the Hind and the Hart, would become the Hurricane. This still used a very similar idea. You took metal tubes, you bolted them together onto fairly substantive frames. The front part of your aeroplane, you're covered in metal to protect the engine and the pilot, the rest was fabric, easy to repair. Now obviously you couldn't completely take this idea on to create the Typhoon, or its next door neighbour, its nearest sibling, the Tornado. When the specification was issued for the aircraft that would become the Typhoon, the specification also called for the use of different engines. One of these obviously was the Napier Sabre, and the other would be the Rolls-Royce Vulture. The Vulture engine had this horrible propensity to burst into flames. Very few Tornadoes were built. They all ended up as test and evaluation aeroplanes and would eventually be scrapped. Early Typhoons, the very first production, or not production, but the prototype versions, would follow on in many ways, would draw on many of the Hurricane lessons or Hurricane ideas to create the aeroplane. Early aeroplanes had virtually all metal canopies. The problem with that, of course, reduction in the amount of vision. Fighter pilot, you need to be able to see literally 360 degrees if it's possible. It was a car door type. It was difficult to get out of. Guns freezing, cold guns. Breeches freeze up, guns don't fire. Very embarrassing. Answer, take ducting from the engine, feed out to the wings. Suddenly, guns work nice and happy, guns all fire.
In my time in the Typhoon, it was armed with machine guns and or cannon.
The early production batch of Typhoons were all fitted with Browning machine guns. These were 8 in number, originally intended to be 12. However, this second option had been removed from the specification as it had been realised that A, the weight would have been too great, and B, the time taken to reload these guns after every sortie would have kept the aircraft on the ground for far too long.
One of the flight commanders, who was a Belgian, a very good chap and very popular and a good pilot, was taking off in formation because it was a grass airfield, and in the early morning, and his tyre burst, and the consequence was that he ran into the next Typhoon, and he was killed. But the chap in the next Typhoon, in fact, survived, although he was severely shaken. And he was a Belgian, eventually became the CEO of the squadron. The Typhoon was much more roomy than a Spitfire, and indeed a Hurricane was more roomy than a Spitfire. In the Spitfire, the machine fitted around you more or less like a glove, but not so the Hurricane, and certainly not so the Typhoon. You were sitting in the Typhoon. You didn't feel that the Typhoon and you were all part of one unit. There were a great many more instruments than there were on the Spitfire, and of course you very soon became accustomed to them and looked at the ones that mattered to you and didn't bother about the ones that didn't.
Once it had been decided that the Typhoon might make a very good ground attack aeroplane, the first thing that was required was clearances of various bombs already in the Royal Air Force's inventory. The standard weapon normally carried by the Typhoons during attack raids, when they were actually acting as bomb-foons, would be the 250-pounder or the 500-pounder. New weapons would come on stream, such as very rudimentary cluster bombs, incendiary bombs, and also napalm tanks were also trialled underneath the Typhoon, although they were never adopted as a standard weapon.
Halton Camp. Once in a while, the workshops of this famous training centre are quiet and deserted. For once in a while, Halton takes time off to celebrate its great record of service. A parade of cadets and their mascot is held upon the square. For 25 years, Halton has been turning apprentices into craftsmen. Craftsmen who, in their turn, help to build up the Air Force of today.
I had a very hairy moment in the Typhoon at Manston. I was a flight commander, and we were on readiness one morning when the weather was absolutely filthy. And I told operations that we couldn't fly because the weather was too bad. So they said, well, could you send up just a couple of aircraft? I said, no, the weather's too bad. So they said, well, you could send up just one aircraft. So I said, well, of course, you could always send up one aircraft. So obviously I felt obliged to go up myself. I took off, and it was indeed, I was in cloud almost before I left the ground. But worse than that, I found that the Bofors gun on the edge of the airfield attacked me, and I could see these cannon shells going very uncomfortably close to my wing. I don't know how they didn't hit me. At Manston we were engaged mainly on protecting the country against German raiders. And secondly, we became engaged because the CO, Roland Beaumont, decided this was a good thing, engaged in attacking German communications. So we became accustomed to doing ground attack, often at night, and attacking trains successfully. The loss of Typhoons was very small. So this was really the precursor of the use of the Typhoon as a ground attack aircraft, which went on to great success during the invasion, when they were armed with rockets.
I volunteered for the RAF in 1941. I was subsequently sent to Canada and to number 10 Elementary Flying Training School in Hamilton, Ontario. Then graduated in Harvard's and subsequently got my wings in June 1942. I was posted to a Canadian fighter squadron, 130 fighter squadron, flying Hurricane Mark 12s, which were a delightful aircraft to fly. I flew those for months until subsequently I was posted back to England, where I joined 198 fighter squadron, who were flying Typhoons, the Typhoon 1B. Bit of a frightening experience really to start with, because the first time that you flew in one was your solo, you might say. Takeoff speed was about 130 miles an hour before she got unstuck. Coming into land, coming over the fence at about 180 miles an hour, 200 to 180 miles an hour, and touching down at about 110.
The original batch of Typhoon fighter bombers were fitted with 8 Browning machine guns. However, a bigger firepower was needed, a more concentrated firepower was needed, and although Hispano cannons were, still are, one of the best weapons available, there were problems in acquiring enough breech blocks to make these guns available in large enough quantities. However, once this had become available, the next production batches of Typhoons were all going to be fitted with 4 20mm cannons, as this would concentrate a large amount of firepower in a small circle in the shortest possible time, thereby causing the most destruction. Except of course for the very small batch of fighter reconnaissance aeroplanes where one of the cannons was replaced with photography equipment.
We did have a problem with the aircraft engine, with carbon monoxide. It wasn't really the engine, it was the design of the aircraft. Drew the engine nacelles were forward, as is natural, and then the design drew a lot of the frames inside the cockpit. And so we had to fly at all times with oxygen. The other snag was that, and I was caught with this once, closing the canopy head. And on the end of your gloves, there was a small tag. And if you weren't careful, you'd catch the tag in the canopy, between the canopy and the roof, as it were. And be stuck up there with your hand. And it's not too easy to land a Typhoon with one hand up in the air like this and only one hand to handle everything else.
Napier's Sabre was the attempt to bolt 2 engines together and drive them through a common drive shaft. Unfortunately for everybody concerned, although it looked good on paper, the Sabre would start to suffer from certain problems. The first of these would be problems with the oil feed. This would become clogged and cause the engine to overheat and eventually to seize, causing our intrepid pilot to either abandon his aeroplane or follow it down into the crash landing. Having dealt with the oil feed problem, Napier's found another one. This would be problems with the seatings of the valves. These had not undergone the process known as nitriding. This meant that there would be build-ups of carbon and metal particles which would cause the valves to malfunction. Eventually, with help from Bolt and Paul, all of these problems would be overcome, although it would take many years before the Sabre would become a reliable engine on the front of the Typhoon and later the early Mark Tempests.
Intent of 198 Squadron was a South Coast defence, and we were employed principally on this task for quite a long time, whereby you'd have to maintain a cockpit standby from the early hours, 2 hours, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. Most boring thing, really, except we didn't know when you'd be sent off into the air.
The Typhoon squadrons based on the south coast had one task only, and that was to hit incoming raiders who were Focke-Wulf 190s. There was slight confusion at certain times between the Typhoon and the Focke-Wulf 190, although it should be borne in mind that there was a great disparity in size. The problem, of course, with chasing a Focke-Wulf 190 was that if it climbed height, the Typhoon was lost. But at low level, the Typhoon would win hands down every time.
From late 1941 till April 1943, hundreds of trains had been destroyed by rhubarbs.
A rhubarb is when you take off and fly over enemy territory at about 200-300 feet. You were just given a general direction, and you could do what you wanted. Make as much nuisance of yourself as you could. It usually meant attacking trains, and they were great to attack, because a little humble train would blow up into a million fragments if you hit it with a few cannon shell.
I was born in Germany in 1921 to a sort of upper middle class Berlin family, and I had a very good childhood until the Nazis with Hitler came into power. Being Jewish, we had to leave Germany and fortunately immigrated to England in 1934. And we were considered friendly aliens in those days. We had to pass a tribunal. I had always tried to join the Air Force. My application was accepted. And in 1941, I transferred to the RAF and then was sent to Canada for training. And from Canada went to the United States. I had elementary training in Lakeland, Florida, and my advanced training in a place called Dothan, Alabama, where I finally graduated as a fully fledged pilot, earning my silver wings and RAF wings. And up to this present day, I don't know what happened. Whether suddenly somebody discovered that I was still a German national, that my father had been in the German army, or other reasons, I don't know. In any case, I was sent back to England and then trained some more, eventually on Hurricanes, then joined 609 West Riding Squadron in October of 1943, on the day they celebrated their 200th victory in the air.
Possibly the greatest and the most explosive, literally, extra added to the Typhoon's armoury would be the 60-pound rocket, and would be released by Typhoons in great waves of explosive rocketry across the sky. A maximum of 8 of these weapons could be carried, and their primary purpose was for the destruction of tanks and other soft-skinned vehicles.
The Air Ministry must have thought that having these incredibly powerful fighters, that they would equip us with a new armament. And so, in the case of 609, they equipped us with 8 air-to-ground rockets, with each one with a 60-pound warhead, and sent us to, I think it was Fairwood Common in Wales or somewhere, to train for a certain amount of time to fire these air-to-ground rockets. So we really initiated this air-to-ground close support for the Army. We were all very excited about it because we thought, here we've got the fastest fighter in the world, now we are getting air-to-ground rockets, and we became pretty efficient at firing them. If you remember, they didn't have any gun size which would, we used our normal gun size, and you had to make a calculation for your angle of dive, roughly speed, wind direction, and if I look at my logbook, I had an average error of, I think, 56 yards. Now, if you consider that each 60-pound warhead had the explosive power of a 6-inch naval gun shell, so if you fired a salvo, you were really pretty destructive, and in 30 or 40 or 50 yards error, you were extremely useful against German tank concentrations and artillery, particularly 88 and 105 millimeter cannons.
The 2nd Tactical Air Force was formed on the 13th of November 1943. Its role would be to provide support for the ground forces as they moved across Europe should the Allies mount an invasion of the German-held continent.
The targets which must be attacked and destroyed before the Allied armies can set foot in Western Europe are scattered over a vast area and affect the whole Nazi military machine. Defences of every kind, special anti-invasion weapons, big coastal batteries, gun sites and shore defences, E-boat pens and hideouts, railway centres, engine repair shops and rolling stock, industry of every kind which helps to arm the German forces. These are the targets which are being destroyed so as to paralyze them our invading forces.
RAF rocket-firing Typhoons take on troop concentrations, strong points and army headquarters in a series of lightning attacks.
One of the main problems that afflicted the Typhoon throughout all of its career, its long, illustrious career with the Royal Air Force, was a disturbing tendency for the tail feathers to come adrift for some unexplained reason in flight. The initial thought was that the junction point where the tail unit actually was attached to the rear fuselage was failing. And initially, a very large steel strap was riveted around the outside of this to reinforce that area. However, this problem still continued. It was actually more tail heavy than it should have been. It was completely out of balance. So the design team came up with another fix for that area, which are known as fish plates. These were riveted over the joint, being about 24 in all. They're made from aluminium, so they're obviously lighter, which meant the aeroplane wasn't going to be tail heavy when it flew. This, however, wasn't quite the answer to all the problems, as odd occasions, tail ends kept coming off the aeroplane. So they started to look somewhere else. And the only other area they could look at was the elevators. Now, was the elevator flutter? Hawkers decided that possibly the flight control system was the problem. Their answer was to slightly alter the running of the rods that control the elevators, and also to completely rework the balance system for the elevators. Both these precautions, the strengthening and the changing of the elevator control system and its balance system, did result in a marked reduction in tailplane failures. Although the Typhoon did suffer from these now and again till 1945. The reason that any aeroplane is fitted with auxiliary fuel tanks is to extend its range. For the Typhoon, not only did it extend its range, it also created that wonderful thing that we use today, loiter time over target. It allowed an aeroplane with a reduced weapons load in this particular case to overfly the target or stay close to a target until called down to attack it. The original version of this fuel tank was a complete cylinder, and it had a pipe taking the fuel out and a pipe putting air pressure in. Pump the pressure in, out comes the fuel. The problem, of course, with that particular kind of thing, and Sydney Cam had actually mentioned this early on in the design stage of this tank, was that as the fuel reduced in quantity, you're going to get this terrible slopping about effect, which alters the trim of the aeroplane. To counter that, they put what are known as baffles in, which does precisely what it says. It baffles the fuel, stops it moving about, and kept it all compartmentalized, but you could still pump it out into the aircraft.
The squadron was really like a team, but when we used to go on certain fighter sweeps or recce, it was a great honor if they took you along, because normally the squadron commander or flight commanders were the first ones to have a go at an enemy fighter, and you were lucky if you managed to get a shot at them. I had an unfortunate experience that in November, I think, of '43, one of my first operations when we were supposed to give a medium level cover to the American Mitchells, I think. I was so keen to get on the show, even though I didn't have long-range tanks. And of course, what normally happens, we missed the rendezvous, or the Americans missed the rendezvous, I can't remember. In any case, we were flying around for about 15 minutes before we caught up with the Americans, then went across the channel. They were going to bomb Abbeville. As I'm about to cross into France, my engine cut on main tanks. And I switched over to reserve, and suddenly occurred to me, how am I ever going to get back to England? And I called up my squadron commander, who was a wonderful man called Thornton Brown, and he said, "You bloody fool, reduce your revs, get a homing for Manston," which was the nearest airfield at the time. So I turned back, and unfortunately, about 5 or 6 minutes later, Thornton Brown, including 2 other pilots, were shot down by an American high-level fighter escort who had never seen a Typhoon and mistook it for Focke-Wulf 190. So that was a rather very sad and tragic happening.
The Typhoon was like many, for some reason, Allied aeroplanes, in that gunners, other fighter pilots had a great difficulty in recognizing what the aeroplane was. Bedecked as it was with roundels and fin flashes, squadron badges, squadron codes, for some reason people took an instant dislike to it and tried to shoot it down.
I had the distinction of being shot down not far from Boulogne. I was leading a flight, and I could see behind me an aircraft which I was convinced, and still am convinced, was a Spitfire, firing at me. I had a nasty shock because a bullet came through the perspex and landed up in the temperature gauge, the instrument that showed the temperature of the glycol. There was flames coming from underneath the engine cowling. I couldn't tell what temperature the engine was at because the instrument that showed me that was no longer operating. So I bailed out and had to sit in my dinghy. So I'm a lifetime member of the Goldfish Club.
To try and persuade American fighter pilots, even Spitfire pilots, not to shoot their allies down, the aircraft originally had big white bands painted on the upper and lower surfaces, and in some cases round the nose. Although this did help in keeping the itchy trigger fingers under control, it was felt that they actually made them too visible to the enemy.
And that's why we were decked out with black and white stripes to identify the Typhoon in particular, before they decided that they were going to do this black and white stripe business with all aircraft flying during the invasion. Only they changed the width of the stripes, so our aircraft had to be repainted with narrower stripes in those days.
In reality, until D-Day occurred and all the Allied aeroplanes were flying around with large quantities of black and white striping everywhere, gunners on the ground, other fighter pilots, and the Americans took great delight in shooting at the poor old Typhoon.
I remember flying top cover to a large mosquito raid on the Eindhoven battery works, and they absolutely flattened it from one side to the other. Most impressive. It's all right, we viewed it from 7,000 feet, we were perfectly safe, but they were flying around practically at 0 feet, just in circuiting the battery works, and they just flattened it completely.
I did get hit, fortunately in an ancient Typhoon that was very well armoured. It was an old Typhoon with the coffin cockpit canopy top, and people didn't like it very much, but unfortunately my aircraft was US at that time, and I flew this, and we were attacking the Phillips works at Eindhoven, and it had armour plating below my seat, and that was hit by flak, and it fragmented the armour plating, which came up, entered my thigh and my eye, and I thought I was blinded, because I looked in the rear view mirror and all I could see was a big red splot where my eye should be, blood streaming back from it. But I blink, 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 and I found that I could see. There was a mess of cheek and eyelids, and there was a hole in my left thigh. But apart from that, I seemed to be okay. And I came back and landed and had some surgery done on the eye, which is still not quite right. I praise the man, whoever he was, who put that armour plating underneath that particular aircraft that I was flying on that particular day.
They then formed us into the 2nd Tactical Air Force, which meant that we were attached to the British and Canadian armies prior to D-Day and had to learn to live under canvas and be extremely mobile with mobile intelligent ops setups, and became really part of the army.
I was fortunate enough to witness the invasion of Normandy, because we were sent to attack a German headquarters just behind Caen, and this involved flying across the Normandy beaches at 7,000 feet, and we had a fantastic view of the whole thing with large enemy battleships, thousands of boats and men, and I wouldn't have believed it.
One of the reasons why we were able to gain a tactical surprise over the enemy when we landed in Normandy on June 6 was that his radar stations had been the object of determined attacks by our fighter bombers and rocket-firing Typhoons. Our Typhoons flew more than 1,600 sorties, firing over 4,500 60-pound rockets.
Typhoon Pilot Sergeant Ted Dunn of 266 Squadron was the first man to bail out over enemy territory on D-Day. Slipping through enemy lines, he appeared back at his squadron, bringing with him the first enemy trophy of the invasion, a German helmet and rifle.
On D-Day, Typhoon squadrons dive-bombed the beaches and enemy strongholds in support of the army.
The Luftwaffe stayed away.
We didn't see any enemy aircraft of any kind. I was attacked by one aircraft over the beaches that day, who was an American, who couldn't identify a Typhoon.
The RAF was digging in. The standing corn was going down under the tracks of bulldozers. the sappers were laying down runways as easily as laying lino on the floor. The airfields were completed as fast as the squadrons could take them over.
As soon as the Army engineers built airstrips over in France, I think I was the first one to be sent over to find out if it was safe for the squadron to land. And I think it was an airstrip called B7. And I couldn't understand why there was so much flak over B7. Landed, and there was silence around me until I saw a lot of our steel helmets popping up from slit trenches around the airfield and signing me to jump out of the aircraft and join them. And we found out that the Germans were only about two or 3 miles away. So it was certainly not safe for a squadron to land. I had to sleep in a medical tent in a trench. And that same night, the airstrip was overrun by some German panzers. And I was very fortunate to get back to England about, I think, 24 hours later. And then a few days later, it was decided it was safe.
From factory chimneys and other observation posts only a shell's throw away, the Germans watched the airfields. They watched the activities of Typhoon squadrons commanded by such aces as Group Captain Tim Maurice. For here in Normandy, the RAF was using a new form of aerial artillery, the rocket-firing Typhoon. This weapon was giving the enemy his biggest headache, a headache caused by a 6-inch shell traveling at 700 miles an hour, a projectile able to pierce the armor of any tank yet built.
We had quite a few interesting jobs after the invasion, and I remember one going down a road in Normandy and spotting a Tiger tank. And the majority of, I'll not say all of them, but the majority of tank crews would just bail out and abandon the tank. But in this case, he didn't. He was going past a pub, and he just seemed to turn rapidly and went inside the hotel through a coach entrance. I couldn't see him, so I perhaps shouldn't have done. I brought the whole hotel down on top of him with rockets.
This is the RAF rocket-firing Typhoon, Britain's deadly single-engined fighter-bomber that has done so much to break up German panzer columns. These are the rocket projectiles. They arrive in various components which are assembled by ground crews before loading into the plane. Here are the tail fins being fixed into the body, or rocket motor as it's called. Simple enough to look at, but devastating in effect. The rocket motor is now screwed into the projectile, and that's the head containing the explosive. The completed rockets are then conveyed to the waiting planes, ready for fixing. Each Typhoon carries 8 deadly rockets which are electrically fired. Many of our attacks were recorded by a movie camera placed in the wings of the plane. We are going to show you some of the films this camera took. Even without rockets, the Typhoon is a formidable weapon. It is a first-rate fighter plane with a speed of 400 miles an hour. All our aircraft are developed for their own particular job. The Typhoon has to give air support for ground forces. It is a fighter, dive bomber and rocket carrier, complete flying artillery. In one day alone, rocket-firing Typhoons destroyed 81 German tanks and immobilized 135 others in the battle for France.
The Typhoon squadrons fired salvo after salvo, hitting German forces, factories and supplies. The Allied forces had fought their way from the Normandy beaches but got bogged down in the Caen area, with the Typhoon squadrons backing up the army and destroying vehicles, troop concentrations, rail transportation, ammunition dumps and German tanks. German resistance was stiff.
The men of the Rocket Typhoons were on call all the hours of daylight. But in spite of this, they always managed to find the odd pause for relaxation, the odd minute for those all-important chores.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word and the skies are not cloudy all day. The air is so pure, the zephyr so free, and the breeze is so balmy and light, that would not exchange my home on the range for all of the seasons bright. Oh, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy.
The enemy shells caused damage, but the enemy shells did not interfere with business. The Typhoons might have concentrated on the enemy gunners, but there were bigger fish to fry. The Germans, too, were trying to build up a striking force, but the German supply routes were open to attack. The Typhoons had their losses, but they were light. In this case, the pilot escaped unharmed. Through a rapidly closing gap, the enemy convoys dashed out in an effort to escape.
I think there was a lot of anger at the Falaise Gap. Real anger, because Montgomery had been attacking to get through, but unfortunately there was no way that he'd get past the city of Caen, and we lost so much armour on the bocage that the tanks, our tanks, were not a match to the Germans, and they're being brewed up left, right and centre. And it's a horrible sight to go in and see under your wings. Your friends are underneath you and they are all being brewed up. It's not a nice sight. So when the Falaise Gap came and we broke through and the Germans were in full retreat and the pincer was closing on them, there was a lot of anger. And we went down and strafed with, I think, quite a lot of deliberate hate.
In 3 days, the RAF destroyed 5,000 vehicles. The roads from Falaise began to smoke with the burning wreckage of von Kluger's army. The Allied forces raced on. As they went, this is what they saw. An army had been splattered over the roads of France. Tanks and troop carriers, mobile guns and mortars, cars and carts, papers and photographs, shoes and socks, horses and men.
And we went back afterwards on the ground to look at it, and it was nauseous because a lot of the German stuff was pulled by horses, and they of course also had been shot up. But seeing the Tigers and the Panther tanks, just ruined rusty shells lying there, gave us a great deal of satisfaction.
This is the meaning of the term air power. The Battle of Normandy opened the doors of Europe. The march on Berlin has begun.
The Allies painfully continued their slow march eastwards through France during the summer of 1944. They built airstrips as they moved forward with attack and counterattack. The Typhoon squadrons continued to have their hairy moments. Rick Dupre from Australia must have been born with 9 lives.
I was told that nobody had ever overturned a Typhoon and got out of it alive, because invariably you broke your neck or your head got stuck in the mud and you died. Well, I proved this to be quite false. I was coming into land. As I approached the airfield to do the brake, to land the Typhoon, you aimed at the end of the airfield and then pulled it up in a zoom climb to lose speed. And at the top of the zoom, you dropped your flaps, you dropped the wheels, round you came, and you're in line to land. Well, as I was about halfway up the zoom climb, the engine stopped. Absolutely rigid. The 4 blades were stuck there right in front of me. And I was scared. I brought the aircraft round, and I found that I was coming in at a heck of a rate of knots. The starboard wheel hit a bomb crater that the Americans had left, and I turned over, nose over, and it was quite strange to go backwards in a Typhoon with the grass flowing the wrong way behind your head. And I landed with a crash, but fortunately I'd landed really close to 6609 airmen, the Yerks, the mechanics, and they rushed out and they actually pushed the tailplane up. And by the time they got the hood back, I fortunately had remembered to remove all the bits and pieces that attached me to the aircraft. And instead of falling out on my dome, I was able to put my hands down and save myself from breaking my neck, and crawled out from underneath. Great cheers, because it had never been done before.
Initially, after the D-Day landings, the idea was that the squadron, i.e. this time just the aircrew and their aeroplanes, would become divorced from their ground crew, who they'd actually got to know very, very well. You know, the ground crew knew the aeroplane, they knew their pilot, they could tweak one to be happy with the other. Unfortunately, some genius in command somewhere said, let's divorce our ground crews from their air crews and their aeroplanes, and we'll have them called combat servicing parties. Sounds good, didn't work. Aircrew not happy with strange people working on their aeroplanes that they didn't know. Therefore, in those kind of conditions, with an engine that had a tendency to be a bit flaky, you wanted the guy who's been loving your aircraft to death for weeks, months possibly, to be there to fix your aeroplane. And this crazy idea of mobile servicing parties was got rid of within weeks. And the ground crews and the air crews got back together again to form what was actually a very good working relationship. Landing in somewhere like northern France, in summer, when it's dry and it's windy, and you take an aeroplane with a very sensitive engine and initially not a very good filtration system, and put them all together, and you start having serious problems. In fact, the situation got so serious, they actually had to bring all the Typhoon squadrons back to the UK temporarily to develop new filters which would eliminate the dust problem. These dry fields were like dust bowls. And of course, as you went belted across the place, you get a bit of dust in the engine, it grinds things away, it keeps, more dust you get in there, the more grinding damage there is, and suddenly your engine stops working.
The relentless round of rearming and maintaining the temperamental Tiffies continued day in and day out.
I can remember one particular case with Ken Adams. He was leading me and we were going down onto an attack on a 88mm gun that the Germans had positioned in a farmhouse or alongside a farmhouse, and it was stopping the Polish armour coming up the road. He went down and fired, and what happened was he didn't actually hit the 88mm, but he hit the farmhouse, which collapsed onto the 88mm. When I came in, it was struggling to get out of it. And I fired and hit it, and it was destroyed. Ken Adams didn't see this, so he came round again behind me. And as he came down, he saw something tearing out of the village and thought it was this, instead of which it was some poor German in a hay cart with a couple of horses. And unfortunately, I don't think he did it very much good.
The Germans continued to counterattack in northern France. But with the Allies pounding the German armies day after day, they were slowly being forced to retreat eastwards.
I was never afraid of admitting that at times I was shit scared. And I shared the tent with an Australian who was my closest friend, Norman Merritt. I used to talk to him about fear, and he said, I'm not afraid. And I said, I don't believe it, you know, how can you not be afraid? And he said, Heine, which was my nickname, I am really not afraid. I remember taking him with me to Paris shortly after the liberation of Paris and introducing him to the sister of a girlfriend of mine, and he fell in love with that girl, but he was so scared he wasn't able to, you know, to make it. But having said that, in the air he did not know fear.
You carried out your parachute, and when you got to the Typhoon, the tailplane was just at an obliging height that you could put the parachute on it and bend over and do it up, and then you were in a crouched position to go. But unfortunately, being in a crouched position just after breakfast and quite scared, most of the fellas did a chuck up, and if you looked along wiping your mouth, you found that most of the other characters had done exactly the same thing.
I think fear only arises when you have time to contemplate it. When you have something visible to do, like saving your life, you haven't got time to be afraid, you just get stuck in. It was on a Sunday, I remember, when the CO came up to me and said, look, Dickie, he said, we've just got a raid on. We've got to attack a target. He said, well, you'll only be about an hour and a half. Won't take very long. In fact, it took just about 12 months, because that's when I got shot down, behind Caen. I thought, oh shit, that's what I thought.
Diese Maschine brennt und ist Sekunden später nur noch ein qualmender Trümmer.
Living in hopes of starting the engine again, I stayed with the aircraft. And then, miraculously, a field appeared in front of me. And I piled the aircraft into the field, must have been doing about 200 miles an hour, belly landed, and walked away from it. That was the end of my Typhoon experience. I was captured and interrogated, but only mildly, because I think the Germans were a bit busy in other directions. Eventually put in a cattle truck and ended up in Sargen in Silesia, which is better known to the public as the Rocking Horse camp, I suppose, where the Great Escape happened. But that was long before my time.
In June and July, rocket-firing Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force flew more than 6,400 sorties against a variety of targets, including tanks, armored transport, enemy headquarters, airfields and communications, firing some 38,700 rockets.
Even though our operations, or our shows, as we used to call them, didn't take more than 15 or 20 minutes at times, they were extremely dangerous because the Army really relied on us. And when they were faced with German tanks or 88mm guns, or whatever, they called in the Typhoons to destroy them. So we had introduced a system which was called cab rank, which meant that 4 aircraft were at the end of the so-called runway, and you had a grid map on your knees, and then the ACP fired I can't remember, a green or red light, and you used to take off and you climbed to about 8,000 or 9,000 feet above the airstrip, because if you went further out, you got German flak already, because they were only a few miles away. And when you got to your operational height, a controller, an RAF controller usually, or sometimes Army controller, took over in a forward tank or armored car and gave you a grid reference to fly to, and then said in 15 seconds, you will see some red, yellow or green smoke, go down and attack. So we didn't know what we were attacking. We flew over to that reference, went into a screaming dive, and then found out there were either tank concentrations or anti-aircraft emplacements and so on. And attacked and then returned to base. And the moment we took off, another section of 4 aircraft took over. So the Army had continuous air support. And when you came back, you were rearmed and then back onto the cab rank. During these operations, we had considerable losses. Mainly due to German very accurate anti-aircraft, but also because we were extremely vulnerable. It's like the helicopters today in Iraq or somewhere, flying from at 9,000 feet or 8,000 feet, diving at speed sometimes reaching almost the speed of sound, well over 550 miles an hour. The danger of pulling out too quickly in order not to hit your own debris resulted many times in the Typhoon going into a high-speed stall, which meant you had it because you flipped over on your back and straight into the ground. So we lost people, or some of our boys that way.
But the problem that afflicts all ground engineering personnel, whatever era they serve in, is weather conditions. In the winter, you're frozen, you're cold, reared all to the bone, and you're wet. And during the time that the Typhoon squadrons were in action, especially when they'd moved over to Europe, which was when it was all the improvised airfields there, when it was horrible, it was really horrible. Being a mechanic on any aeroplane in those kind of conditions is horrible. You also had all the joys and delights of rearming in a howling force 9 gale, which is, under normal conditions, was hard work.
And there was always the ever-present threat from the Luftwaffe.
The hunted tiger had struck back with all his might. Luftwaffe had gathered together all the fighters it could muster, and with them carried out surprise raids against the Allied airfields in Belgium and Holland. And the Luftwaffe had met with some success. But the Luftwaffe had to pay for their success, and the price the Luftwaffe paid made it a very poor bargain indeed.
During the Typhoon's time in service, when it was employed as a leaflet bomber, there were only 2 reasons to drop leaflets. One was to persuade the Germans to surrender. They're going to lose, you might as well surrender now. The other was to the people in the Netherlands, to tell them to stay where they were, we're on our way. That was the only two reasons for using the Typhoon as a leaflet bomber. To use it as a food bomber was very much a similar idea. Occasionally, small units of the British Army, or even their own chaps, or even their own servicing parties would be left behind, or would be too far in front. Of course, you've got to get supplies to these people. You can't always take a Dakota in there. It's a glorified target for anybody with a decent anti-aircraft gun. But a Typhoon, high speed, low level, let it go. As long as they know where the target is, there's every chance they're going to hit it. The idea of using aeroplanes as food bombers, which is a strange idea, was obviously used again in Holland, where the Germans had isolated various towns in Amsterdam and all the rest of it, and said, we will have the occupants starve to death. The Air Force, of course, responded by flying over with just about anything that could carry anything and releasing all these containers with food aboard, which helped all the people of Holland survive the ravages of the Germans.
That enormous radiator in front obviously ruled out any type of forced landing on water, because it acted like the plane just disappeared like a submarine.
Towards the end of the war, we were put on attacking shipping up in the Baltic, and we were told that if we fired not at the target, fire at the target with the cannon, strafe it with the cannon, but then when you fired your rockets, aim your rockets 50 to 100 yards this side of the ship, And what happened, the rockets entered the sea, leveled out and hit the ship from underwater like torpedoes. And they virtually just blew up in front of your eyes.
Just after the D-Day landings in that hot summer of 1944, the Germans unveiled a new and terrifying weapon, the V1, which was a flying bomb nicknamed the Doodlebug by the Allies. They were being launched from the Pas-de-Calais area towards London. .137 Typhoon Squadron was given yet another task, diver patrols. The objective of the diver patrols was to intercept the V1s before they reached their target and shoot them down. It was found that the Tempest, Mustang, Spitfire and Mosquitoes were fast enough to catch the Doodlebugs. The Typhoons were tasked to pulverize the V1 launching sites with their massive armament.
And then after Falaise, which the Typhoons were very much responsible for destroying the SS divisions in Falaise, advanced with the army through Belgium, Holland and finally Germany.
Die feindlichen Maschinen im Visier. Die Feuerstöße gehen aus Rammnähe in die Terrorbomber hinein.
Although much depleted, the Luftwaffe could still put up a resistance to the ever-advancing Allied armies and air forces.
Jetzt erfolgt der massierte Angriff der Sturmgruppe. Die Feuerstöße jagen heraus. Mit einem Schlag geht der ganze Feindverband brennend in die Tiefe.
On the ground, German divisions still resisted wherever they could. But retreat back into Germany was inevitable.
And there was a Canadian pilot called P.V. Williams, and he was hit. In fact, we didn't see any plume of white, and so we called him up and said, "You're going the wrong way." And he said, "I'm hit and paralyzed." And so he could not control the aircraft, and it must have taken him several minutes before he hit the ground at a sort of gradual glide. And the last thing he said to me, "Order me a late tea."
And finally they went into France, Belgium, Holland, and at last Germany itself, with the conquering Allied liberation forces in the great days of 1944 and 5. Occupying the overrun airfields of the Germans, they moved up with the armies into Belgium and Holland, keeping up the pressure on the enemy's supply lines, smashing his centers of communication, driving his aircraft out of the sky, and keeping our own intelligence service informed of his movements.
In Belgium, Holland, France, Germany, the weather was very wet and we were living in tents. And the serviceability of the aircraft was excellent. You had your own team of mechanics who became really your family because you knew them so well and they knew you so well and they really looked after you.
Another problem, of course, was always the spark plugs. If they got oiled up, 24 spark plugs to change. Lot of unhappy engine guys, 24 spark plugs out, clean them up, put them back in again. So they always took good care of their engines, just because they didn't like to work for a living.
As the Typhoon squadrons moved into Germany, they had to contend with airfields that had been carpet-bombed by the Allies.
The problem is, of course, you can't see where you're going on a tail-sitter aircraft. And so, it was up to the troops. Get on the wingtips and shout at your pilot, wave at him. Eventually they would develop types of communication, hand signal, for left, right, stop. Why would he stop? So the guy could then get onto the other wingtip and push him backwards. They would do their best to repair the greater craters. They had to. Aeroplanes fully laden with weapons, fuel, they don't like, especially when they're going across really rough ground, they don't like being cranked sideways here, there and everywhere. They don't like it at all. Ground crew on the wingtip, come rain or shine, dust or snow, point to the pilot, go left, go right, okay, goodbye.
Though we were really very effective, but we had also enormous losses, which was something completely new to us. And furthermore, it was very difficult to get replacements. Though the fighter pool at Lasham was full of young fighter pilots, nobody in those days, and I'm talking now the latter half of 44 and the beginning of 45, wanted to join the Typhoon squadrons, the Rocket Typhoon squadrons, because they heard about these tremendous losses.
Oh, the poor old Tiffy. Oh dear. The Typhoon was built for a job. It didn't do its initial job, it went on to do another job, that of an excellent, outstanding ground attack fighter. However, there was never ever going to be a place in the post-war Royal Air Force for an aircraft like the Typhoon. New aircraft were being built, they were going straight to the maintenance units. However, there weren't that many engines being built. The airplane would fly into the maintenance unit, engine propeller would be removed, back to the Hawkers for the next one, new aeroplane in a field. 6 months later, it's saucepans. So by 1946, any Typhoon left was in the field somewhere, waiting to be chopped up, except for one that was in the United States, on armament trials, and would end up in the Smithsonian Museum and would eventually, courtesy of a swap, end up in the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon.
Over 500 Typhoons were lost after D-Day, but 247 enemy aircraft were destroyed by the Tiffy.
I liked the aircraft, yes. And I think it was an extremely efficient close support weapon for the army at that time.
A lot of people didn't like it, but I did on the whole. She was not a very nice lady. You had to keep her well in check at all times, but on the whole she was great, because it's not every day you get to fly an aircraft that can do 420 miles an hour, at least not in those days.
It could become a monster in a way.
Well, she wasn't an airplane really, she was a flying gun platform.
Another point that was very interesting with the combined rocket and Typhoon attack was the sheer obliteration. It was equal to the broadside of a 6-inch cruiser.
I enjoyed my time in the Typhoon because I enjoyed being in the squadron. But I can't say that I was very keen on attacking engines, railway engines at night. It was very difficult to spot them. And when you had spotted them, we were attacking them over the most heavily defended part of France. And it was no fun, at least it wasn't any fun to me.
I found that the longer I flew the Typhoon, the more I loved it. It was an aircraft that could take any amount of damage, any amount of flak, and it would get you home. And it would land you safely back at base. It was really, really strong. And of course, being powerful, it gave you a sense of superiority.
Hawkers, when they came up with the Typhoon, were looking to build a high-speed fighter that was really, really good at all altitudes. Problems with the Napier engine meant that it was good at medium to low altitudes. changes of emphasis of tactics meant it became possibly the most outstanding ground attack aeroplane of the Second World War.
You're cruising at 400 knots, which is a speed at which the Focke-Wulfs and the 109s had to attain in a bit of a dive to get to you. So I know you had to be careful of the Hun on the tail, but he had to come from a long way up and a long way down to catch you up at 400 knots, I can tell you.
So did the Typhoon do its job properly? Yes, I think it did.
Tempest. In comparison to the Typhoon, in fact there was no comparison. It was comparing a cart horse to a race horse.